Well, over the last 6 years, the Portland CSI has been building the industry forum, and here we are. And it's been made possible by the vision and work of many very talented professionals. Please hold your applause, though, as I take a moment to introduce the industry forum team. And industry forum team, if you're out here in the audience, please stand, but everybody's standing, so it doesn't matter. Let me just acknowledge, and we can give our appreciation to Tony DiVincenzo of Ideate, Alexander Lungershausen of Henneberry Eddy Architects, our master of the 6x10, Bud Henson with Window Tech, Corey Morris of Clark Jost Architects, who is unable to join us this evening, but joined us for lunch today and did a great job for the industry forum. Chris Ferguson of Atlas Supply, JC Amend, the CSI executive assistant who has a day job with Melvin Mark Properties. And with special thanks to Kathy Hempel of Diamore, and I am Jody Moore, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening and today, and to celebrate the beauty and fun of what we get to do together. So please help me in expressing our appreciation to everyone who put this event together today. Thanks. So now it's very much of a pleasure for me to introduce the individual who inspired a vision that has brought this event to life. We were recalling the first conversation, passing each other and saying, wow, wouldn't it be great to bring some really wonderful architects to Portland, and people would enjoy that, and how could we do that? The gentleman who invited, and will introduce our presenter this evening, a wonderful collaborator and keeper of cultural tradition, Don Stastny. Donald J. Stastny, FAIA, has been practicing architecture. He's an urban designer and process facilitator for over 40 years, rebuilding communities physically and culturally throughout the country and the world. Recognized as one of the preeminent competition advisors and managers in North America, Don designs opportunities for design professionals to create outstanding architecture and places. And we've all known Don these many years here in Portland and done wonderful work together. And yet his professional life is vibrant and full and doesn't seem to be slowing up. He's currently beginning 2 new competitions, the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C., which is their highline, and an urban open space system for Cambridge, Massachusetts. In fact, he has joined us today, having just traveled from Cambridge, and thank you, Don. He's on call for 2 major works now moving toward realization in St. Louis for the Grand Center Cultural District, where they're knitting together 13 cultural institutions and 3 universities into a new neighborhood, and on call to be in Austin, Texas for Waller Creek, a 1.2-mile urban waterway from University of Texas to Lady Bird Lake, and creation of a new district adjacent to downtown Austin. Here in Oregon, Don is the design architect for the Oregon Military Museum and the ongoing work at Bandon Dunes. In fact, as I mentioned, Don flew in from Cambridge today to be with us all, and he will be participating in the Northwest Region Conference starting tomorrow morning. A fellow in AIA, American Institute of Certified Planners and Institute of Urban Design, Don is a fierce advocate for design excellence and an expert at building collaborative partnerships. Please help me welcome our own Northwest treasure and a true friend, Don Stastny.
What does CSI stand for on the TV show, isn't there?
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good. Okay. After having been up a few hours since about 4 o'clock East Coast time, if I doze off during this introduction, you will please forgive me. This is a wonderful time of year in Portland, for those of you that have been here before. Not only is it the event of our CSI industry forum, of which you've all been experiencing today, it is also my birthday. and Patty Tillett and I both share that we've added a 1 to our 70. And but the third thing of those of you that may watch this or may not admit that you watch it, this is nearing the finalists of Dancing with the Stars and The Voice, both. And so in many ways, I think tonight is a little bit our Dancing with the Stars and a little bit of The Voice. I want to reflect on the 6x10 and those of you that were able to participate in that earlier. And Alexander, thank you so much for heading that up and getting it together. I want to thank the students who presented both from Portland State and U of O. And I just hope that the passion, intellect that you bring to your thesis projects continues on as you enter the profession. We're very lucky to have you, and hopefully you will continue to be a part of that. There's presentations. There are presentations on very innovative development, and it is very Portlandy. You know, you want to keep Portland weird, well, you also want to keep Portland working, and this is very nice. The use of art and the way that we incorporate art into our buildings, into our city, is an important part of it, and for those that were a part of it. And the last thing I would like to say, John Gray from Interface, who gave a presentation on plumbing and water, needs to get some animation in your slideshow. So we'll line you up with some of the kids that can do this, John, wherever you are, and we'll make sure that the next time you give a presentation which has the content that you have also has some pizzazz and wow to it going on. So thank you all for participating in the Petacucha and the 6x10. Alexander, especially to you for putting it together. What I do is really a result of you. My first competition that I ran was Pioneer Courthouse Square. And since then, that has been a part of my practice as we've gone forward. And what that working in the competition world means is I have the opportunity to come across people throughout the world who are doing really fantastic things. And so I look for people, not necessarily for what they've done, but for what we can expect in the future. And I look for people that give us that kind of opportunity, I think, to see into their mind and really envision how they might go forward. Snohetta, as many of you know, if you've done your web search and everything else, first came to my mind, and I think many people's mind, when they won the competition for the National Library in Egypt, Cairo. In Cairo? Alexandria. And here's a group from nowhere, ostensibly maybe from Norway, or some other place in the world, that all of a sudden get this commission to do this great library. And then not too much longer, we see that they've got the Oslo Symphony opera, and that's built. And here's two major buildings in the world that have been built by this group. So it wasn't too long ago when I was running a design competition on the National Mall for 3 different facilities, for Union Square, for an area around Washington Monument, and for the Constitution Gardens. And I was going through the submittals, and all of a sudden I come across Snøhetta. I thought, wow, this is cool. We finally get to see these guys and work with them and find out what they're about. Now, this wasn't always real easy, because one of the benefactors to the competition on the National Mall, right at the last minute, slipped in this thing that you had to be a U.S. citizen to be a lead designer. He was a strong supporter of Boehner and those other guys that are in the Congress. And so we put that in there, assuming that people that were a part of the competition would recognize that, and if they weren't citizens, would not put in for it. But in any case, once the submittals came in, we had to vet to see if people were a part of that. Now, a guy named Craig Dykers, you kind of think, well, American, somewhere else. So we put out a call to his office, and we got one of the young people on the phone, and we said, "Is Craig a citizen?" And they said, "We don't know, but we'll find out." And within 2 hours, Craig was back to us, and it turns out that Craig Dykers and his wife Elaine are both graduates of University of Texas. Born in Germany to military folks, and then going to the University of Texas where they met. So that kind of got us over that particular hurdle. But what it gave me was an opportunity to see the way that Snøhetta's collective minds work. And it is absolutely wonderful thing to watch, because it is a combination of understanding form, but also the impact that form has on spaces, on the lives of people. And I think that's what you'll probably see from Craig tonight as he goes through his speaking. Now, there's another thing that I learned from Craig. It is wear a pink shirt. Craig comes in for his interview with the National Mall wearing a pink shirt under a black suit. And I swear, after he left, the only discussion from the women was, "Did you like the pink shirt?" So tonight I'm wearing a pink shirt in honor of you, and I see you are keeping up the tradition, Craig. I think that's enough rhetoric from me. I think that as part of the industry forum, we've continued to try to bring in people that are inspirational, that are aspirational, and that can maybe inspire us to reach another level of design. Our commitment is still design excellence. And how can we further design in Portland? How can we further design nationally and internationally? And this particular event supports that. So before I introduce Craig, I'm going to introduce two people. Elaine Molinar. Elaine, if you would stand, please. Elaine is a managing director of the New York office, happens to also be married to Craig there. And then Nick Rader, who is a managing director of the San Francisco office, who is working on the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, where they just came from. So with no further ado, would you please join me in a very warm welcome for Craig Dykers.
Thanks, Don. Thank you. Pink shirt, that's crazy. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Portland. I actually came here last in 1987. So I remember when I was here in Portland at that time, it felt like a city that was sort of waking up from something. And clearly it's woken up as I come back so many years later. I have fond memories of Portland. I traveled here with my then girlfriend, now wife, Elaine, and we had just met, started dating, I suppose, not so long before. I think this was our first trip where we flew anywhere, which was nice. And I remember I was at the time working with Barton Myers, and I did the pen and ink renderings of the Portland Center for the Arts, which was why I was here. And I wanted to see the Alvar Aalto Church, which I would have loved to have seen, but I was so much in love that we just walked around the city, Elaine and I never saw Aalto's library. Aalto's library. So that's my memory of Portland. But it's a wonderful place to be, and I think there's a lot of synergy between here and where we've been living for many years in Oslo and Norway. And I'm certain that I'll sense some links to a way of understanding of life here that will feel familiar to me. Well, here's my first slide. A little bit of a strange thing to see in an architecture lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about why and how we do things, as well as what we do. I remember some years ago, I was reading some newspaper and I had the usual headlines about how terrible things are in the world. There were wars beginning and ending and fights in the streets and people killing each other and all these kinds of terrible headlines that we sometimes get accustomed reading about in the news. And as an architect, you look at those headlines and you always blame someone else. Well, surely that's the politician's fault. It's the fault of education. It's the fault of families who don't raise their children in the right way. It's the fault of legislators who don't meet the demands of changing society. It's everyone else's fault, but it certainly isn't our fault because we're architects and we're just here to do good things for people. But I'm not sure that that's true. So anyway, as I was sort of thinking about this, I read this wonderful quote from Marshall McLuhan that the environment that humans create becomes their medium for sort of defining it, their medium for defining their role in it. So I thought to myself that in some way, architects must also be contributing to this problem. We make the things that define our world, the world around us. So if we make mean things, maybe people are going to be mean as a result of that. If we make ugly things, maybe people will be actually ugly. If we rip and tear at the very thread of our philosophical understanding, maybe it will challenge our psyche. So in some way, the places and the things that we make must influence us. And so if that's true, and if the world seems to be a rather rough place and we're contributing to it as well, maybe there's some way to see architecture that could work in the other direction. Maybe we could create places that are civil, places that allow us to act in a way that defines ourselves as separate from the world around us. So one of the things I said was that people are not abstractions. Buildings are. And I know when I studied in school, and perhaps some of you had a similar feeling, I remember making buildings, and we had these assignments, and even as I left school, the same sort of routine arose, that you would think intellectually about the forms that we were making. You would think very much about the shapes and the urbanistic responses, and you'd play around with massing. But really, any discussion of people in any direct way rarely existed. They simply were these sort of things that got shoved in at the end, and we would define them numerically, perhaps, or in some other parametric equation. But really, the opposite is true. People are real fleshy creatures, and so I began to think about that myself. This is a very interesting and somewhat trite quote, but very nice. It was a wife of the British ambassador to India, I think in the 18th century, said this: "Civility costs nothing and buys everything." And it sounds a bit silly, but it's actually true. And I think when we think about the works of architecture or other things that we make, perhaps we should understand that just providing something that could look at the creation of space that might allow for a civil discussion really doesn't cost any extra. Being generous doesn't really cost any extra. This is a wonderful quote from Temple Grandin. She's a wonderful author who deals with autism, and also she's working with domestic livestock. I read her books quite a lot. I recommend them to you. She said, "Nature is cruel, but we don't have to be." And there's certainly some truth to that. We are not really anything special. We're an animal, just like the other animals around us, but we do have the capacity to withstand certain degrees of anger. We have the ability to find restraint at times. And so some way we can use that manner of thinking as we create works of architecture. Well, this is from me. I've never heard anyone walk into a building, drop to their knees and go, "Oh my God, what a great concept." It simply doesn't exist, that way of thinking. Interestingly, as architects and designers, we use the word concept regularly. But as I'm teaching, sometimes I ask people, the students, to define the word concept for me, and you'll get several answers, some of them similar, but many very disparate. And so I realize that we use this word concept so heavily, yet we probably very often would disagree on what it actually means. So in our case, we like to say that a concept should be something that really it's more about a question. So there's another quote from Marshall McLuhan. Start with a theory and you begin with an answer, and start with an observation and you begin with a question. Because a concept, first and foremost, is a question. How can you possibly derive the correct answer if you have not asked the correct question? And a really good question can show itself in many forms. It can be a kind of mysterious question. It can be a kind of funny question. It can be a very dangerous question. But the best questions are questions that lead to other questions. And I think a child knows this very well. They always ask you things that don't seem to have an appropriate answer, or an answer that's very definitive. And these questions that lead to other questions create dialogue, and of course the dialogue allows us to respond to each other in very unique ways. So I think in our office this is a part of what we try to do. We try to ask questions before we give answers. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story that I found interesting, because much of what we do has to do with narrative, and narrative remains a powerful tool, I think, in our conscious as human beings. But I read this story, a few stories recently, and I connected the dots, and I wanted to share this with you. Many years ago, on April 2nd in 1917, 3 artists left their studio in New York City in Greenwich Village, and one of them went out to buy a urinal, a men's urinal. That person was Marcel Duchamp, and he was looking for this urinal to create a work of art that some of you may know, called The Fountain, or sometimes referred to as Art Mut, which I'll show in a moment. But I was fascinated when I found out that that day that Duchamp walked out of his studio with his 2 friends to buy this toilet, to create this piece of work that we now understand in a very clear way. It had very interesting origins. But before I tell you about that, I wanted to say that I don't know, perhaps some of you had the same feeling. When I was a young student of architecture and I began to understand conceptual art or abstract art or contemporary art, this was a very powerful piece to me. And it was at the time I was learning about architecture, because it said to you that art in and of itself did not have to rely on a sense of skill or a sense of beauty. It could in fact rely on an idea. And that idea could be powerful enough to change your sensibility about who you are and where you are. So it's an abstraction, and I found it very, very intriguing. And of course that story that I was mentioning to you became even more intriguing, because I learned that the day that Marcel Duchamp went out to buy that urinal in New York City was the day that Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war in Germany for World War I. And I just can't help but think that there was some relevance to that this rather abstract, rather radical move, perhaps one of the more fundamental modern conceptual developments of art at the time, was made on the day that we went into World War I, which I also found intriguing and made the piece even more intriguing to me. This piece never really was shown. In fact, it was taken out of the exhibition, and so it had a life after the exhibition it was planned for. It has a very kind of odd sense of eroticism to it. Like there's a kind of like a nipple there that you can see if you look closely in the shadow and the light here. And it continued to be an influence on me for many years. But sometime later, I learned about another artist. His name was Auguste Courbet, of which you have several of his paintings here in the museum. He's a wonderful painter. In fact, one of the paintings, the Courbet paintings, I think culminates the European wing on the 2nd floor of the museum here. But he created a number of works which also were influential. But one in particular that I learned about was called The Origin of the World. It was painted in 1866, long before the modern movement. And I saw this thing. And I was like, wow, well, that's pretty conceptual. And I was struck by the piece, of course, not only because of its rather weird vulgarity and extremeness, but because it was so long before what Duchamp had created, and it's really based on something very, very real, a physical human being or the human form framed in a very unusual way. And this, in a way, I think, in some sense, set up the development of modern thinking and painting and art. So that kind of struck me as something that could be valuable to remember. Many years later, I read about another work. 1966, this work was made, 100 years after the work that you just saw. It's called The Waterfall. This was the last work of art that Marcel Duchamp ever made before he died. And I can't help but think that he was somehow impressed by Courbet's work himself, The Origin of the World. So while I had been fascinated by Duchamp's work with Armut and the fountain, because of its abstract nature, I somehow came to realize that perhaps Duchamp in his later years as he was dying understood the power of the human form and the power of what it means to be alive and to be a person in a very direct way. And I'm certain that he was somehow influenced by this work. So something told me that his trajectory of thought had moved into this world of us as fleshy creatures, as rather strange, irrational creatures. And so then I started to think, well, where does that leave us with architecture? We are kind of strange creatures, and I thought, well, architects can maybe be divided into two kind of huge trajectories. There's the architects who have to straighten everything up. You know, if it's not in line, it's got to be in line. Everything's got to be modular. It's got to be somehow repetitive. It's got to be somehow understandable and feasible. And then there's those architects who are just shaking everything up. They've just got to mess it up, whatever it is. If it's in a line, you've got to get it out of a line. If it's square, it's got to be a blob. Everything's got to be kind of messed up. And so I thought, are there any architects out there that are just going with the flow, just understanding who we are as irrational, fleshy creatures? And I started to think maybe we could do that. Our work somehow develops a link between the predictable and the intuitive, these two worlds that are trapped inside of our mind that contain our ancestors, our gatherer and hunter ancestors, and our domestic lifestyle of the most recent era, maybe 300,000 years old. And as we create works of architecture, maybe we link these things together. But I'm often reminded about who we are. Sometimes every day, I think, when I'm at our office is in Bowling Green in New York City, and it's just where those yellow windows are. And we look out over this very famous bull. Perhaps some of you have seen it. It's the Bronze Bull in Lower Manhattan. And I noticed when I look out the window that about 50% of the tourists take this picture, and about 50% of the tourists take this picture. And I'm always astonished by how many people really just want to grab these balls and take their photograph next to them. They're so shiny, you can see. Busloads of people come there, and we're just strange things as human beings. We like to think of ourselves as civilized and intelligent, and certainly we are, but we're also irrational, and we do things that just don't make sense. And why should we pretend that that doesn't exist? And perhaps the works that we create could at least embrace some aspect of that rather strange side of who we are. So in our office, we developed a very clear identity as to how you enter the office. There's no secretarial station as you walk into our office. There's no one there to greet you. You walk straight into the kitchen. We have a beer tap and a fruit bowl so that we'll look a little bit healthy in the foreground. And you just kind of have to find your way around and figure out where you want to go. People feel comfortable when they enter kitchens. You probably know that from parties at your home. People don't like to leave the kitchen. And so there's some degree of calming down that the kitchen provides visitors. We have a large sort of flexible room that's like a dining room with a table where we interact in large groups. We're named not after a person, we're named after a place, a mountain in Norway called Snohetta. So the notion of authorship is a little different in this office as opposed to some types of architecture offices. So we can pull lots of resources together and develop ideas and talk quite a bit as we manage the process of design. And that same table This is the same table in Norway. We have a similar setup. We also eat at that table. So every lunch we come together. We have birthday parties there. So we work and we meet and we eat at the same table. And there are no walls. Everyone has their meetings on these tables. So they're very, very long, about 30 feet. And you can have 3 project meetings going on simultaneously within earshot of each other. So you don't have segregated areas for the projects to meet. Everyone meets in one space. So you have to get along with the others that are also meeting on a different project than you. And that breeds a degree of civility in the workplace. We sometimes get together with little charrettes, and I love this picture because it's a group of us working on a model, and it's rare that you see 2 people building a model at the same time or more, 3 maybe in this case. That takes a great deal of effort to develop that kind of attitude in the office. And in this case, even one of those people is an intern from the university in Mexico that came to work with us. So everybody can contribute in their way to these exercises. We test different ideas in the workplace. So that's sort of the introduction, and I'm going to show you our work as that's what you're here to see. But I would like to somehow stress how valuable it is that we have these rather weird bodies. We should be as active as possible. The way our work atmosphere is embodies movement in the workplace, so we try to move as much as we can. So just to prove it, we'll take maybe a 30-second break, catch your breath, turn to your neighbor, shake their hand, and say, "Hey, I'm glad to meet you. It's nice to be here tonight," and we're going to catch some breath. So there you go. Shake your neighbor's hand. What's that? Yeah, I know, it feels like a church, doesn't it? Well, one of the things that we ask ourselves is how much does our work give versus how much can others give back to us? It's a common sort of idea that when you're working, especially in architecture, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, we all just want to make things better. It's like, we're going to do this, it's going to be good, it's going to be great, and it's going to just make everything better. And, you know, it's a kind of natural tendency to want to just make everything better. And probably the reality is that you can't make things better. The only way you can really make things better is allow for multiple people together to make things better. In other words, we can't make it better for everybody. Everybody has to make it better for everybody else. So a certain level of the work has to allow for things to occur that wouldn't necessarily be a part of what you would imagine. Many of us think about how this could occur in different ways. One of the things I think that's important in our work is the notion of perspective, how you're able to visualize your surroundings. I always like the story of the little meerkats who just climb up on a little mound and they look out for the dangerous birds that are going to attack them while their colleagues eat the food on the prairie around them or the savanna, and if they see a bird, they make a noise and they all run for the hole. But they work together and they use perspective to gain some confidence of where they are. This is a physical condition, and it's one that we often don't take very seriously, but it has a tremendous impact because depending on how we see each other, for example, in my case now, I can see all of you very clearly, which gives me some degree of security, whereas in your case, you're maybe only seeing me and a bunch of backs. But if the floor were raked or sloped, you would see things like in a theater with a little more cognition of your surroundings. We use these ideas on a number of projects. The capacity to change the foreshortened world into a world of depth. Because the more faces you see, the more eyes you can connect to, the better you feel about where you are. This was first, perhaps most known in one of our earlier projects, as Don mentioned, the great National Opera and Ballet in Oslo, in Norway, which when it opened really was seen in this kind of sculptural context. But actually, it's now most known because of this, the fact that people can climb on the building at all times of the day. They can occupy the building in a very definitive way. They feel they own the building, not because they've bought a ticket to the opera, but because they can walk their dog to the roof of the building or fool around. And it's sort of grown into a very strange phenomena, and all kinds of things have happened that we weren't particularly considering. So. Oh, you can turn it up. Yeah, okay, that was totally illegal. Do not try that. And if any of you were getting AIA points tonight, you just lost them all just by watching that film. So, but that was sent to us by apparently a French daredevil who didn't make any commitment to the opera to do that. He just went and did it, and it showed up in the mail, and we were just kind of astonished. But it suggests, that things can happen, and in a way, when they happen in the way you least expect, they have sometimes the most relevance. And that has occurred on many of our projects. We created the great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. As we won that commission in 1989, it was our first commission. And we built this building over the course of 13 years, working almost continuously to finish it. It was meant to be a resource for knowledge, and of course it does remain that way. But where it really grew to prominence was rather strangely during the Arab Spring and the revolution in Egypt in 2011. And of course, we were very concerned about the life of the library, if it might burn down or be occupied. Instead, what we found was that the citizens of Alexandria protected this building. They actually formed a human circle around the building, both pro-government and anti-government groups, to ensure that this edifice of culture, edifice of learning and understanding would be preserved throughout the riots. Over 200 people died in Egypt just in the first 2 weeks in Alexandria alone, yet this building remained intact, and in fact, it became a resource for peaceful dialogue and remains so to this day in Egypt as the troubles still continue. So again, the life of the building has a trajectory which is very different than we could have imagined. This brings us to a number of other projects I'd like to show you in a little more detail. They're newer. I've presented the opera and the library before, so I'm not spending any time with them this evening. But there are a number of related projects. We won a commission to make a library or a student learning center in Toronto for Ryerson University. It's on a rather busy commercial street. Their library existing is on the right. This is why architects have a bad reputation, I think. That's a library. It has no windows. It feels really massive. It probably looked really good in a pencil and ink drawing, though, so it was built. And I think they needed to break free from this, so they asked us to participate. Because the building is on a commercial street, we needed to actually create a commercial zone on the base of the building, shops and other things to react to the street in the proper way. And the library would be up above that. But rather than simply creating a traditional plinth, we tucked the commercial facilities into a sort of sloping ramp that lifted you up into the lobby of the library itself. And that particular surface was studied very carefully to ensure that we would bring as much natural light as possible into this new plaza that we were creating. We would form the building in such a way as to funnel natural light toward the entrance and towards this plaza space and lobby. And we would then create a series of steps that led you up over the commercial facilities and brought you into the building itself. And those could be used by different people to meet each other, to meet their friends. And so that the building really was as much about the civic space to the exterior as it was about the use of the interior. There you can see the commercial spaces sort of tucked in under this ramp, leading up below this beautiful blue sort of metal patterned ceiling, which is partially exterior and partially interior. The facades themselves are fritted to modify ultraviolet light into the building as it's very sustainably designed. And those blue metal panels, which I'll show you in a moment, each are are sort of formed in a way to very carefully bring light into the public spaces, and also provide this kind of rather unusual blue hue to the light. The floors of the library are themed in different, almost random ideas, generally landscape oriented. So there's a floor that's called the cave. There's another floor that's called the beach. I suppose there's the kind of amphitheater room. We had all different sort of themes, a garden room and so on. And so as you stepped out onto each floor, you would experience a different condition. This is the one we called the beach. So on this floor of the library, there are no chairs and no tables in the traditional sense. You either sit on the floor or sit in beanbags, and it's almost as though you're taking a day at the beach to spend instead at the library. The lobby itself contains these blue metal fins that guide the light and guide the visitors into the interior. And that is a more of a public forum space as you enter the library proper. These were the first mock-up on the right as they were building it, and then they began to place in these metal panels. The blue metal triangles that you see on the right are actually folded by a single sheet of metal, so it's a bit like origami, and they're repetitive, so they just rotate depending on how we want the pattern to modulate the light. And they change color as you move your head a little bit back and forth as they're painted with a kind of a paint that sort of adjusts itself with your optics. This is the mock-up just as it was being finished, standing underneath it. And you can see just in a stationary image, already there's a kinetic character to this panel. And I can assure you that as you move your head in time, it's even more kinetic. So the building's actually under construction. It's about 40% complete right now. It should be opening beginning of next year, end of this year, moving rather quickly. They haven't yet put the metal panels in, but you can see some of the fritted glass that modulates light inside to the spaces beyond. So we're looking forward to that. We're also working with a rather substantial project in New York City, in addition to some other projects we have there, and that is we are in charge of the reconstruction of Times Square. So we're working with all of the streetscapes between 40th and 50th with a focus on 42nd to 47th Street. So we're ripping everything out of the ground there. I don't know if some of you have been to Times Square, and we're trying to make it a better place in some ways, a place that's more flexible for use and has more availability for people to program it in ways that may seem appropriate. But the first thing that we need to do is make it to some degree at least safer. A number of people are killed there by cars because there's not enough room on the sidewalks and people just flow into the streets. There are 42.5 million people a year that visit Times Square, so it's rather intense. It's one of the most heavily visited touristic sites in the world, and there's almost no space for humans to either comfortably interact or to move freely. So there's a first sort of effort was to try and understand all the different things that occur there. There's, of course, the theater district. There's on-Broadway shows. There's off-Broadway shows. There's things that happen above you and a lot that happens below. It's like a glacier. There's enormous amount of infrastructure below Times Square. There are a lot of tourists, obviously, and then there's kind of locals, which we sometimes question whether they're local or not. There's a degree of constancy, and there's, of course, a degree of temporary qualities when their great parade, Macy's Day Parade, and so on occur across Times Square. It can be both fast and it can be slow depending on the time of day. So a new design for Times Square has to accommodate such a wide range of conditions. It cannot possibly tolerate one clear or easily observable solution. The first thing you really need to do is just look at all the muck. There are 200 years of redundant infrastructure built into Times Square that nobody could manage. So the first thing that we thought to do was remove at least 70% of the stuff on the street just to make it easier to walk. And then the space that exists in Broadway today would be given over to pedestrians. So we are permanently rerouting vehicles off of Broadway on these 5 blocks onto 7th Avenue, and what is left over will be given over to pedestrians, and they need to move in an equally efficient manner as the cars. One of the things that has always been a problem at Times Square is flooding. It always floods somewhere around 45th, 46th Street. The people that work with the utilities kept putting in new drains and changing the drain system, but it always flooded and nobody really knew why. It was almost kind of a mystery. Well, one of the things that happened as we were there at Times Square, the landscape architects were looking across this kind of vast expanse, and they noticed something very interesting. If you look very carefully, the heads of the people all create a kind of arc-like shape. There's actually a divot or a kind of valley in the middle of Times Square that nobody had really noticed. And the site's so big, the contours didn't really make it clear. But in fact, Times Square is kind of like a big hammock shape, and it's lowest in the middle. And we tried to figure out why, because it looks really flat when you're there. So we went into the history books and we found this old map. This is actually what Times Square looked like before the grid was put into place. So in fact, it was one of those unique places where actually four creeks came together into a swamp. So Broadway was a creek coming down to a low point, 7th Avenue was another creek, and 45th was the confluence of yet the 3rd and 4th. So actually Times Square, the crossroads of the world, was a swamp at one time, and you probably avoided it at all costs if you were moving across this portion of the landscape. But over the years, the asphalt covered it up, and nobody could figure out why the place was flooding like it was, and it has to do with what's just immediately below the asphalt. So here you can see it's actually an 8-foot drop, which is a pretty substantial drop from the edge 45th down to 47th. And so we began a series of micrograding techniques to pull the water off in more immediate locations. All of this was done before, or this thinking was done before we began to have an idea about aesthetically how this place should look or what the identity should be. The next thing we did was we just spent a lot of time looking at people. There are so many crazy people in Times Square, and every type of walk of life you might find there at any time of day, but it's incredibly uncomfortable for people. So tourists just sit on curbs because they have no place to sit. They have just this kind of uncomfortable condition as they move through Times Square. Families have to eat their lunch, children, students, a whole group of students sitting on the street because there are no amenities to serve them. So we began to think that this at least was going to help us understand what we needed to do. I mean, people use everything as a table, or put your Starbucks or whatever coffee cup on the fire hydrant. This amazing USA Today box we watched for many, many hours, and it probably had 50 uses. You know, people using it as a place to lean against, have a conversation, maybe put your child up there for a picture, you know, and this was just in the span of a few hours. So we recognized again that just providing surfaces somehow would be useful for people. You didn't really have to design them very much. We also watched how people moved, which is very troubling in Times Square. In a 2-hour period in the evening, I think, maybe 3 hours between about 6 and 9, 7,500 people crossed just one crosswalk at 45th Street in that short period of time. So we made this map that basically looked at the intensities of people movement across Times Square. I call it the pissed off map, because everywhere where it's red, people are really angry. And as it gets less red, they're generally more comfortable. We used film footage to follow people moving through the site, just to understand better how people move. We looked at how they went from across the streets to different shops, what their routes were as they shopped or participated in retail there. And then we started to try to think about ways in which we could allow this kind of magnitude of people to flow easily across a very complex geometric form, this sort of bow tie of Times Square. Well, as we were talking about what we should do, a very interesting point came up. We were talking about what actually makes people walk in a comfortable manner. And at Times Square, it's a little hard to see, but at Grand Central Terminal in New York City, maybe some of you have been there, there's the great waiting room, and there's an information kiosk dead center in that waiting room. And I've always noticed, and people have always said, it's always nice walking through Grand Central because you don't bump into people and everybody's nice. And if you compare that to Penn Station, where you bump into everybody and you get angry at everyone, there's a reason why that is. And for me, I think one of the fundamental reasons is the fact that this information kiosk is plopped dead center in the middle of the room. If that kiosk weren't there, because we're fundamentally egotistical creatures, we all want to get from point A to point B in the most efficient manner, we'd all cross and hit each other in the middle. And we'd all think that we're the ones who deserve the right of way, and so we get angry at everyone around us. As soon as the kiosk is there, we all find ourselves in the same problem. We're all navigating around an inserted kind of deficit. So as soon as we have a problem that we all share, everyone's nice to each other. So it's a kind of antithetical approach, but if you stick problems in places, they actually make us nicer. So we started to do that at Times Square. We started to look at things that we could get in people's way and actually allow people to flow around them in a unique manner. So we started with a series of terrains and other things, but we eventually started to work with a number of benches and other ideas that would help cue people how to move. In order to get people to also move appropriately in this space, you need to understand daylight. So we followed daylight across Times Square over the course of the year, and there are these three images I love to look at. This is December, 1 in the afternoon in the winter. The light shoots straight down Broadway, and if you've ever been there at that moment, it's astonishing, the sunlight just plowing down Broadway. If you stand in the center of Times Square for just 1 hour, it changes to a band of light down 7th Avenue. So it just switches, and you get this new alley of light. And that's rather a beautiful experience. And likewise, during the summer, the sunlight shoots right along the streetscape in an rather northeast manner. So these three conditions we also thought we could play on, and we began to work with small little reflective elements. We didn't want any electric light in Times Square. There's enough of it on the walls and in the sort of ceiling of the space. So these little stainless steel reflectors would capture sunlight in a very, very unique way and sort of sparkle and give your eye something to manage as you moved through the landscape. So they're divided in particular areas where we expect more crowds to be, less crowds to be, where people can move more quickly. And then we installed a series of benches that would help contain groups in a different way. This is a picture of the prototype of these little, very inexpensive concrete pavers with the pucks in them to capture the light. They're woven into the site using both the grid of 7th Avenue and Broadway, and you get this very beautiful sort of condition where you're never clear whether you're in 7th Avenue or on Broadway. We removed or tried to erase the lines of the curbs where the street was, because wherever you see a line of a curb, your brain immediately thinks danger because there's a car coming, even if the street is closed to cars. So we had to try and erase the sense of curb identity here. And here's a kind of detail of one of the drawings at one of the intersection points. The benches that we created are rather substantial. They're about 50 feet long and at times 5 feet wide. Each one is designed for a different kind of condition, but they can be used in a number of different ways, and I'm sure a number of ways we haven't foreseen. You can lean against them, you can sit on them, you can sleep on them. Who knows what will happen there. They have a sort of orientation to allow large groups to gather and also segregate the tourist groups from the more speedy traffic along the facades, which are New Yorkers trying to get to wherever the hell they're going as fast as possible and really angry that there are so many tourists here. So in a certain degree, we're kind of segregating these worlds or planning on that. There's a lot of activities in Times Square. There can be, for whatever reason, group yoga in Times Square. Portland doesn't have a monopoly on group yoga. They do it in New York too. They have a rodeo there sometimes, which is also a very funny thing to see, rodeo in Times Square. And all of that today is hosted by people dragging in temporary electric equipment and stuff to make this work. So instead, we're going to integrate the infrastructure for hosting these over 600 events a year in Times Square within these gigantic benches. So that no longer do you have to drag generators and temporary infrastructure into the site, which will make it last longer and be more cared for. And we designed those in a certain way after sort of the things that we imagine Times Square of the past in the 40s, sort of film noir quality, and they can be used in all sorts of manner of seating. So we made a prototype of one of these benches, the 50-foot long, 5-foot wide one. We put it out there, and literally within 2 minutes of pulling the fence away from it, people started doing weird stuff. So this is made of foam, so it's not, the actual ones will be made of solid granite. But who knows what's going to happen on these things, and they'll be rather much of a magnet. So we're changing Times Square from this, which is what it is today, to this in the future. Very simple change, a very direct change, but will have significance as to how people move and function in the space. So that will go to this. And this is our eventuality of the Broadway stretch of Times Square. Very broad expanses for people to have various activities. But here's where it is more or less today. This is the kind of huge, we've literally pulled up the street. We've created what I believe is the world's largest pedestrian traffic jam. It took me 20 minutes to go from 41st to 42nd Street walking because I couldn't get past the crowds. There's a detail of it. So really, you should avoid some characteristic of Times Square right now. Wait till we're finished. It should take us about a year or two. We're going block by block. So here's some nice images of it. The amount of technical infrastructure we've had to manage is enormous. We're building the curbstones out of solid granite. They're around 18 inches thick in some areas. They're being hoisted into place. We're about 95% complete with the first block. All of this has to be done with the massive throngs of people around staring at you. And then there's this guy. We call him Inspector Bling. He comes out every day and determines whether or not the quality of craftsmanship is up to par. So it's a very unusual place to have to work. We have completed recently a library, another library building. This one's in North Carolina for a relatively well-known campus, North Carolina State University. The campus, yay, NCSU, yay. They had this as a library, yet another fine example of a beautiful, wonderful library you just want to walk into. Of course, those buildings were characterized by that kind of librarian who, if you said anything, they'd hit you on your hand, or you weren't allowed to bring food, and the last thing you'd ever want to do is talk to your neighbor. So they put little walls between you. They had tried to adapt this library with some success, but they needed a new library to contain the new groups of people that were using the university. And they had a separate campus called Centennial Campus that was being built for new engineering facilities. Our site was basically where that circle was there. And the dark gray buildings were built and the light gray buildings were still being planned. We looked at the notion of landscape in North Carolina and how the valleys and streams lead from the Smoky Mountains across the Piedmont and into the savannas and plains leading out to the Atlantic. And this school was also known for its textile manufacturing and studies in the textile sciences. So we began to think about that as an idea that could characterize the building. So we took this rather direct Platonic form of the landscape and began to adjust it into a more organic form that would lead from this sort of Palladian ideal of a university down to the organic natural condition of Lake Raleigh, which was at the furthest south of the site. We also integrated similar thinking in the identity of the building and how the functions would be strung together within the interior of the building, and we wanted the facade to express that. So it was working in multiple dimensions with a similar idea. In this particular case, we had a very low-tech manner of controlling light, these solar fins which control light on all sides of the building in a particular way, horizontal versus vertical, depending on the orientation toward the sun. And that created a condition in which you could sense, in a way, the different characteristics of movement in the building, how the functions within the building connected to one another, so that you were given a mental map of the interior even before you entered. And it would change from night to day. You would see a structure, a unique structure, as the light quality changed over the course of the year. And I think this is really a beautiful image of a detail of one of the facades. If you look carefully, you can see that you're getting reflected ambient light and reflected artificial light mixing on some of these fins, and it creates a very soft line. And I often say in architecture, it's very hard to make a soft line. It's easy for us to make a hard line. Even when we try to make soft lines, they're just hard lines that are masquerading as soft. But here you have an ephemeral line that's constantly changing within the very clear structure of these solar fins. And sometimes in the summer, as the sun is setting, you'll get these orange qualities, so the fins will adopt the color of the sun in the distance. As you look up toward the sky, they kind of rivet the sky in a unique way and sort of form a connection to the clouds. I often say that the clouds are a part of the landscape as much as the ground, and somehow the building must connect these two worlds. This is approaching the building where there's a rain garden, and you can see into the great reading room. And this is the rain garden that collects rainwater from the roofs and distributes it for reuse on the site and in the building. And that's a view of it in the evening as it's constructed. It's still not mature, but it's getting there, and the gardens are starting to grow very quickly in North Carolina, actually. As you look to the building from below, it almost looks as though it's looking. Every time I see the building, I wonder what it's looking at. It has a kind of quality of gazing into the distance. I almost want to look over my shoulder and see where it's going. There's a very interesting line you can see here where the trees across the lake line up with the edge of the fins. So it's as if the landscape had been projected into the building directly. And as you step back further, the trees in the distance line up with the terrace on the top of the building, which is a draw or an anchor. There's actually a very large public terrace at the top that we'll talk about. But as you enter, you come through a very small and very simple trellis. The trellis is very narrow, so you have to sort of squeeze together to get into the building. It's not grand in a very geometric way, although it's grand in an experiential one. There's a separate entrance on the lower level of the building. That entrance actually takes you into a series of lobbies that are really defined by the stair system. So there was someone who was talking earlier today about, in the Pecha Kucha talk about food and how our health is challenged by the food we eat. It's also challenged by our lack of inactivity. So we wanted to create a building that made you very active. You moved around a lot in. So we kind of developed a series of stairs that are psychologically leading you on to always want to move. So the first set of stairs at the lower lobby is adjacent to these two very large windows. Those windows look into an automated book retrieval system, a kind of giant robot that holds or can hold up to 2 million volumes of books. Many of the books are stored in this robot, and the robot can then acquire the book for you. Some of the books are on display in the library. But what's really amazing about it is that this robot will get you what you want, and you can go and watch it go get it for you. So there's a strobe light on it, so you can kind of make this moment where you ask it to get something, and the strobe light goes off. It can be very exciting. And in fact, there's a little sort of screen there, that little screen. When they first opened the library, they had an I'm feeling lucky button, and you could just push it and the robot would get you a random book and bring it. And actually more books were being checked out than they had ever been checked out before because of this new robot. So rather strangely, a piece of technology is creating more circulation for many of the books. As you lead up that stair, you're taken into the next set of lobbies where you look into the great reading room, and the first thing you see are these little red chairs. They actually swing, so they rotate. And it's always funny to see, because one of the things we wanted to ensure was that the first thing you would see would not be a computer or a computer screen. It would be people doing something. So in this case, people always come in there and they just sit on these chairs and kind of swing back and forth. They have no idea why. They just kind of do that. There's no need to do that. But they'll do it anyway. And it's really nice when you walk in and you just see people going like this for no reason at all. And it gets you thinking, maybe I should move a little more too. And as you go deeper into the building, you see a new set of stairs, these yellow stairs on the right. We deliberately put the elevators beyond this main staircase, so that if you're going to the top of the building or going up in the building, most people will say, I'm going to take the elevator. Like here, 3 stories up, you don't take the stairs. So people will walk past that bright yellow stair, yellow being the color of focus, on their way to the lift, and they'll change their mind. They'll because the lift you can see is in a gray, scary, that's the lift there, that gray thing. It's kind of scary. So they go, I think I'll take the stairs, and they return back. So actually you'll find people who have gone to the top of this building, it's a 5-story building, and they've never once taken the elevator. They're always taking the stair, and that's because it invites you in a very careful manner to move from place to place in a narrative that is only formed if you move through the building in this particular way. So you can meet your friends on the stairs, you can look back to where you just came from. As you move up those stairs, you'll see people working. Then you have a view into the quiet reading room where there's yet another stair. That stair leads around and wraps around to a series of workplaces where people can somehow occupy the rooms and work collectively. And then you can look down and see other people working, writing on the surfaces of the building, find a place to check your email messages and so on. There are other color-coded areas. The lockers and the area where you can charge your computers is red. And the only other slightly yellow space are the toilets, a little bit more of a gold color to the toilets, but you always know the toilets are kind of gold colored, and that way all the way up the building. But then you continue on to the next set of stairs, and that leads you past a very nice moment where you can see out. You'll see more people on those stairs. They're all sort of very saturated in this color, and that takes you to the very last stair, which is this little tube, and you step into it and you're enveloped in this yellow color, and it's birch wood on the top. And as you step out of that stair, you come into the skyline sort of reading lounge, and you step out onto the terrace, and there's a view of the surrounding beautiful landscape of North Carolina. Everybody wants to make that walk, and nobody will take the elevator. They'll do it because they want to do it, and I think that's an important message for us in how we design buildings. Another characteristic is that libraries today are as much about making things as they are about taking things out. So in this library, there's 3D printers, there's access to digital technology, cameras and other kinds of things that you can check out, not just check out books, you can use them to make things. There's a lot of very highly interactive projection technology that allows urban planners to operate and study inside the building. But one thing that's important to remember, as Albert Einstein reminds us, that our technology has exceeded our humanity at times. And if we allow technology to manage our lives, we once again lose our sense of civility. So in this building, despite the fact that it is probably one of the most technologically advanced libraries in the world today, we decided to integrate low-tech characteristics of the workspaces. So we put glass tops on all the furniture. So we bought nice furniture that you can't write on. And then because we put glass tops on it, you can write on almost any piece of furniture in the building. And as soon as you feel you can write on something, you feel it's yours. Because it used to be in the old days, if you wrote on the furniture, you get kicked out. But here you can write on anything. And so there are people writing on practically any surface. And it really changes your connection to the building. So people are always coming up with new ideas, interacting with each other, solving problems in a fairly direct and dynamic way. Another characteristic is the shape of the room. It has a character that is very similar to the ancient stoas of Greece, where our first libraries in the West came from. Long, narrow spaces that you have to walk. They're dark on one side and light on the other. In these libraries, there were no books, there were no scrolls. You simply met your friends who were other scholars, and you would move through the space. You'd get to the end, and you'd turn and you'd walk back. The light would change, so your light would be on one side then the other, and you could pace your movement. And it was the physical movement that helped the intellectual conversation grow. And so we adapted that idea here as well, but there needs to be a target. You need something to look at. This particular wall we decided would become a mural, and we worked with an artist, Jose Parla, to create this rather beautiful mural that was painted directly on site. It was very specific for that location. He's a wonderful artist that really works with his sort of body. He kind of moves as he writes these narratives. He's always thinking of a narrative, and he's projecting it onto the surface. And as you see it in different locations, it has a different kind of context. This is the same painting, both images. And of course, as you look down towards the floor, it kind of sucks up the concrete or the terrazzo-like finish of the floor into the painting itself. And that's directly adjacent to the more traditional quiet reading room where you can go and check out a book and enjoy it in a normal way. This project I liked also because I went up just after the building opened, sometime after it opened. I went up to the administration areas, which are pretty normal. And I just started taking pictures of all the desks of the people that worked there who had images of the building on their desks, and I really liked it. It's like, here's my girlfriend, and there's the building. Here's my weird tape dispenser, and there's the building. There's my baby, and here's the building. Here's my Life is Beautiful card, and there's the building. So I think that I enjoy it to see how people kind of occupy this thing and start to connect to it in a direct way. Since that time, we've actually opened up an office in San Francisco. I like this map. I melted Manhattan and San Francisco peninsulas together into a new island. So actually, San Francisco and New York meet somewhere around Chelsea, which is kind of interesting. I call it San York and New Frisco, bound by the Atlantic and the Pasatlantic. They're both connected by bridges and tunnels to somewhere. We just don't know where. But I think it's a funny way to see these two places. The two red circles are where we have our offices in both locations, so rather strangely mirrored on each side of the coast. We are first and foremost there because we won the commission to expand the Mario Botta's Museum of Modern Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. That's Botta's building in the foreground. Our building in the middle, the white sort of horizontal element, and just behind, a 1930s beautiful deco building by an architect named Pfluger. And so all of these sort of pieces work together in an urban condition. The expansion site itself is just behind Mario Botta's museum, so most people have no idea how an expansion could be made on the SF MoMA. It doesn't seem possible, and in fact, this is a substantial expansion of about 230,000 square feet. There will be 130,000 square feet of gallery space in this museum once it opens, which is actually more gallery space than you can find in the New York MoMA, so it will be one of the largest modern art museums on the continent. The building is lifted off the ground. It's pulled back from the property lines. Similar to the Ryerson Library I showed earlier, we've molded the building to allow natural light into the spaces where people move. We've given it the right dimensions above your head so that you feel secure and not too penned in by the architecture. And that space that's been opened up has created a new connection to the alleyways that exist behind Mario Botta's design. The previous structures that were there blocked these alleys from view and from use, and the alleys are rather beautiful, so our desire is to connect these alleys back to the main streets. We also create a very horizontal building that is in contrast to the verticality of the skyscrapers nearby. There's a wonderful gallery that sits right on the main street, adjacent to the passage that leads to the alleyways, where different types of experimental art can be displayed, and this is free of charge, so the whole lower level of the museum is free. Our cultural institutions are really important to our cities. It doesn't matter how big or how small, they all have something to provide. And sometimes they can provide a degree of connectivity to your surroundings that allows you to see the city in a unique way. So this space, these alleys, these links deep into the core of this block were unexplored by the average citizen. And now, when this building is finished, they will become places to have events and to hold different kinds of art, I would say, I wouldn't say guerrilla, but I would certainly say unique and unexplored avenues of art in these alleyways. As you enter this passage, you're lifted up to a courtyard, which takes you straight into a main entry area we call the art court, with another set of stairs that lifts you up. And as you rise up higher in the building, you're greeted by a series of gardens and terraces we've created. This is actually a parking garage that exists today. We're creating this garden that will occupy Calder pieces and other structural elements adjacent to the galleries inside the building. We've also adjusted the interior of the Botta design. We've changed the staircase so that you can see right the way through from the main entrance all the way through to that sculpture terrace I just showed you at the rear. There's a new stair that we had to create because the original stair was not wide enough to accommodate the new numbers of visitors. And with this new stair, you can see right back to that little green garden I just showed a few moments ago. So this is Mario Botta's space with the Snøhetta stair sort of winding down into the centralized oculus and light atrium above. And once you get into the galleries themselves, they're very carefully designed to be as simple as possible, but not uniform, not monotone. So the ceilings have these little vaults that allow ambient light to be tucked into the vaults and task light to be attached to the bottom. This removes about 60% of the cans that are needed often to light a gallery space, so that it will use much less energy as the building operates to show very delicate works of art. So that light that you see above is all ambient light, cooler light, that allows you to see the gallery space without the task. So this is actually a mock-up of that gallery that we built, hung with a few very nice works to show you how you can understand the sort of gestalt of these works within the space. We've created a number of very odd spaces that can be used for performance art, street art of sorts, unexpected works of art occurring in the building. At the very top of the building is contemporary arts, which have a sort of raw ceiling and a raw floor, and they can be adjusted in a number of ways very simply and inexpensively, and all of those lead out onto a wonderful terrace at the top of the building that give you views of the city, so you're often connected to your surroundings, since the majority of art museums have very few windows for you to see out, so this helps you orient yourself in the city. My monitor, yeah, there it goes, it's back. Sorry, my monitor just went off. We were very interested in the notion of water and fluidity as it surrounds San Francisco, so the exterior of the building began to accommodate this kind of maritime climate that you're used to here in Portland, the changing quality of light as rain and moisture fill the air. So we developed this system of plastic reinforced lightweight concrete panels, very inexpensive, that are vacuum formed into original shapes so that the module can change rather easily and create these very soft, subtle conditions where daylight and shadow mix throughout the day. These are some of the earliest prototypes we've made. There are little bits of mica and quartz in them that make them sparkle a bit. So I suppose, similar to Portland here, you can imagine how this facade will react as the sun breaks through the clouds or as the rain and the fog enter the city from time to time. And this is it in the distance on a sunny day, and these will ripple as the sun light changes. So this building we will open in 2016. This is a picture taken just a few days ago, so you can already start to see the rooms taking shape. So we're very excited. It's on time, it's on budget, everybody's happy, so let's have a party. In 7 days, we will be opening a museum at the World Trade Center site. We've been working on this project for 10 years. We're actually making the only building that's on the memorial grounds of the September 11th site, the National Monument to the tragedies of that day. And so what you see here is a rendering by the developers showing the surrounding towers, and our building is this little building in the middle between the two pools. Those two pools represent the original footprints of the towers before they collapsed. So this was at the 2011 date, 10 years after the tragedies, and that was the state of the site. But we have since progressed, and now the building is ready to open. I wanted to show you a few things about that site before it opens in next week. You'll be reading a lot about it. But this is a view of the memorial pools designed by Michael Arad, and they're incised pools into the ground, and they're places where you can find the names of the deceased. They sit immediately in the foreground of some very large skyscrapers, most of them done by well-known architects, including Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Fumihiko Maki, and this is SOM buildings here. And there are the pools in the foreground. So our building sits as the connector between these two worlds. It's a very small pavilion that is the entry into the museum dedicated to the tragedies that have occurred on this site. It's a very light-filled building, a very optimistic building. We like to say that the building is the link between the past that the pools represent and the trust in the future that the skyscrapers represent. Our building is about the present moment in time. And we always said that if we could make one person feel good about their life at this site, we've done our job with our building, because the pools allow you to imagine the death of those that lost their lives, and the towers somehow represent those people that have not yet come or will invest in the future. But here we could see ourselves. They do hold two very unusual artifacts, two of the original columns that were recovered from the site just after the buildings collapsed, and those are in a large atrium. And as you enter that atrium, you'll be able to see up to the sky and see beyond to the World Trade Center towers. And you'll notice that many of the lines of the geometry of this atrium align with many of the features that are around the site. It's a very dramatic moment, a very moving moment to see these amazing structures in place back at the World Trade Center site. Of course, the most important characteristic, though, is that people be able to understand where they are and why they are where they are. And so a part of the building is designed with these very subtle characteristics to the stainless steel skin that modulate light in unique ways. And this particular picture, for example, on the left, is the north facade of the building with no direct light at all. And you can see how much the building facade is changing and reacting to light. The picture on the right is rather astonishing because if you see, the sun is on the east, it's early in the morning, rising from the east, yet this reflection is cutting directly across the shadows, going from the north to the south in an anti-intuitive direction. And that's because it's catching ambient light from the other skyscrapers and creating an unexpected event with the daylight. It appears and it disappears almost as quickly as it arrived. And there's a moment also when you see the building as it comes down into the atrium, the metal facade is reflected back into the glass, and it sits almost like a ballet dancer on one toe. That's Santiago Calatrava's train station behind, which is reflected into the atrium almost like a rainbow. So the building is absorbing its surroundings in a very direct way. But the reason I really wanted to show you this project is because of this particular effect, which is rather astonishing. And I know, I say that this is the building, probably the building where I've seen the most people wanting to press their flesh against it. Everyone that comes to this building walks up to this atrium, sticks their nose against it, puts their hands against it, and actually touches it and wants to look inside. Another thing they do, which I think is really wonderful, is they walk up to it, they see their reflection in the glass, they take a picture of themselves, and they have a little moment of a laugh. And I always felt that if we could at least make one small laugh at a sight as tragic as this, we would have done our job. Because this is, of course, an important means of understanding where we are and who we are. I love this. If you look very closely, that guy in the blue checker shirt, you see him smiling up there, and they're all taking their little picture. The other thing that happens is that everybody just comes along and wants to see things. They want to see where they just saw themselves. They want to see what's inside. So just constant stream of people. The building isn't even open yet when these are being taken, and they're constantly going up. Honestly, the number of nose prints on this glass is spectacular. All kinds of people doing all kinds of things, constantly looking in. And of course, what will happen when the building is open, because it's not open yet, but after next week it begins to open, is when they look in, they'll see the staircase leading past those columns. And they'll see people, not only looking in, they'll see people looking back at them. So there's going to be a moment where you see yourself, and then you look in, and then you go, oh my God, there's someone looking at me. So there'll be this kind of amazing, I think, connectivity that people will begin to have there. But only time will tell. We'll see after it opens next week. Just very quickly, another little museum in Guadalajara, which is based on natural resources of the area. This is our building here. It's a natural science or ambient science museum. We're doing the landscape planning around it. It's on our desks right now, so we're in construction document stage. It's got a beautiful courtyard. It collects rainwater. It has an aviary. You can access the roof. If any of you know Guadalajara, it actually is in the center of a rather beautiful landscape in Jalisco. And this is the entry towards it. It's made of native stone from the area. You'll be able to see people accessing the building in unique ways. All indigenous planting going on around it. One feature of it is this beautiful facade which we created. We call it an urban nest. So we've created a habitat for birds and other wildlife to actually inhabit the facade of the buildings that displaced their habitat in the first place. So it sort of slides into a concrete block. We've created this design to allow different size openings for different size creatures to inhabit them, and it makes this a very beautiful nest that is actually a place where the fauna can reoccupy the conditions of where they came from. So there's a little view of it, and it will be integrated into the facade. So I'm going to finish here. I want to show you a few very quick small bits at the end, as we do a lot of smaller things. Most people don't believe it. We have a couple of very tiny little libraries in the Bronx and in Queens, New York, and Far Rockaway. That's a library in Far Rockaway, and this is our library in the Bronx. So these are new facilities in areas that have pretty high crime rate, pretty underserved portions of the city. We've done a funny little project in Dallas, Texas. It's a barbecue pit. So we did a barbecue pit in Dallas. This is the context. If you don't like that, just wait a few minutes, and it kind of looks like that. And if that's not good enough, eventually it'll look like this. And that's sort of all you get to tell you where you are. And this particular park is in a pretty rough neighborhood in southeast Dallas. There's a lot of crime there. People sold drugs in this little park. And the Dallas Parks Department called us up, and while we were doing the World Trade Center site, and we thought, you know, if they've got the guts, or actually they didn't call us, they called some people we know down in Dallas, and we thought if they call us up and they've got the nerve to call us, then they've got the job. They didn't have any money, so we went to the site. It was a pretty run-down place. The sewer system had stopped working. It was all backed up. There was this run-down little pavilion over there that was mainly used to sell drugs and so forth. So it was a pretty run-down place. But there were these things, like in the neighborhood. It's like, wow, if anybody can do that, well, this is great. So, you know, good neighborhood. But we were really enthralled by the site when we first went there. That's Elaine, and visiting the site with our partner architects there. One of the things we talked about was the proliferation of billboards everywhere, and we thought, what if we took a billboard and like bent it into a shape? You know, sort of created a pavilion out of a billboard. So some of our first sketches had these sort of bent billboards. They changed, they became simplified, and eventually it became this very simple green-like shape, a green frame, framing the landscape, a window in and out of this very beautiful park. So that was a rendering. This was built. I think it took 6 years to finish. We gave them the drawings. The local architect kind of did it. I think after 4 years or something, they called us up and said, hey, we're done. It was like, wow, I can't believe it. They had actually finished it. So it was nice to see, and it's actually become very popular in the neighborhood, and it has this wonderful green color that connects you to the surroundings. And as you look through it, you see the landscape in a very unique way. And there's a barbecue pit just over there where you can cook your food. So we also made a new little children's playground using the equipment that the city has. They needed. Actually, when we showed them the first design, it didn't have this filigree on the facade, and they said, if you make it solid, somebody's going to be standing behind here with a gun, and they're going to shoot us when we go to your pavilion. So we said, well, okay, we'll work on that, and we came up with this filigree pattern, which is very beautiful, almost reminiscent of a tree pattern, and so it's jet cut out of the steel, so it's a little solid steel panel, and it creates these beautiful sort of pattern of light, dappled light across the picnic benches for the barbecue area. They needed a toilet. They couldn't afford a toilet, so they've got a porta potty, and we made this beautiful pattern of mesh steel to go around. This has got to be the best portable toilet in southeast Dallas, and it's actually used quite often. It's very pretty. And now the local school comes to see it, and they do their calisthenics there, and some of the neighborhood, our kids are often playing around there. And someone sent us a picture recently. They went there because it gets architectural tourists in this place, and they saw somebody with Nike tennis shoes that were that green color, and the person said they had gone out and bought the tennis shoes because they were inspired by this color on the pavilion. So I guess it's having an influence of some variety. The last thing I'll show you is the reindeer pavilion we made at the foot of Snøhetta. So that's the mountain of Snøhetta that we're named after, and this is a place where wild reindeer come to mate, as well as move through this area on their way towards the south. And so the pavilion we've created allows you to observe the reindeer without disturbing them. Its interior is made of solid pieces of wood that are laminated together and CNC routed to make these beautiful bench-like forms that could be inserted inside of this Corten steel frame. And they were brought in on a military truck because it's a military base that this occurs at, and slid into place. And once you enter, as you enter the site, there's a little place where you can sit outside. You go through a door, and as you go inside, you're given a panoramic view of Snøhetta and the valley and the reindeer below. There's a little fireplace to keep you warm, and these series of benches that are amenities for comfort in this rather remote area. It's situated just on the edge of a little precipice with a rocky area that had been already disturbed by the military base, so we tried to disturb as little as possible of this landscape when we placed it here. I wanted to end by saying this place, Snøhetta, is very meaningful to us in central Norway. So as many people as possible, once a year, we climb the mountain. So this is our office climbing Snøhetta in central Norway. We get to the top, we have drinks, we have a big party, and then we go down to the bottom, and we have more drinks, and we have another party inside our little reindeer pavilion. So thank you very much for listening to me this long. Thanks. Great.
I wonder if Elaine and Nick would come up as well, please.
Oh boy, that's.
We have a bit of a tradition, in
Do I get to leave my clothes on, or?
more or less, for now. Our Native American brothers and sisters have a tradition of blanketing.
Oh.
Of what?
Blanketing.
Blanketing.
Yeah.
Which is a way of welcoming you into our family. Now, this particular year, because you are Snøhetta, named after a mountain, we got a blanket that is a memorial, or in memory of Timberline Lodge,
Wow.
which is Mount Hood, which is our tallest mountain.
Wow. That's amazing.
And the symbol on it, you got it upside down, but the symbol on it in the center is what is on the,
right.
you all would recognize this on the weather vane, and it is the welcoming sign for Timberline.
Wow.
So with this, would you three get together?
Yeah.
And we will officially blanket you.
Oh, this is fun.
Wow.
It fits.
Feels great.
So we want to thank you so very much for coming to Portland. We hope this will be maybe the first of many, many more visits to Portland. And I think you ought to close the New York office and just open a Portland one. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Amazing. This is beautiful. It's amazing. It's folded. Look at that.
Thank you so much, and
That's folded.
what a wonderful, special day and evening. And thank you for being here and sharing your wonderful selves with us. Snohetta. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here today, for celebrating the beautiful creation of us interesting fleshy things and our wonderful minds. And
Yes, she works
we
in
will
our
look
office,
forward
yes.
to seeing you next year about the same time. And may you carry the inspiration of this day with you all year. Good night.
Oh, amazing.
Her sister is Louisa May Ann's